Today on Blue Values TV, our subject is education. We're going to interview a candidate for the Rocklin School Board. Stay tuned. Welcome to Blue Values TV. Blue Values TV is a production of the Blue Values Coalition. Blue Values Coalition is dedicated to educating, informing, and engaging our neighbors in the governance of our communities. Look for us online at bluevaluescoalition.org. Today we're going to be talking about the Rocklin School Board, and with us is a candidate for the Rocklin School Board, Mr. William White. Thank you for being with us today,
Thank you for
William.
having me.
Let's start out by talking about what is it that motivates you to run for the school board, and what is it that you hope to accomplish there?
Excellent. Well, I think that my reasons for running largely stem from my time spent working in education. Since my undergrad, I've been in the classroom in one form or another, working first as a teaching assistant, and now in my current capacity for Twin Rivers Unified School District as a transition assistant for students in special education, where I do job placement and college and career guidance services for students in our district who are making the step from high school to their post-high school lives. I think during that time I've observed a disconnect between what goes on in most districts at the board level and what actually happens in the classroom. And I'd like to be a voice on the Rocklin board that understands a little bit the challenges that teachers and staff in the schools face every day, and kind of bring a little bit of a perspective of having served in the school site and worked with students, which I think a lot of board members lack, not having quite the classroom experience that I have.
What are some of those disconnects that you refer to, that you're aware of, that you'd like to be able to bridge?
Well, I think a common perception among board members, at least that I've met amongst various districts, is that classrooms should run a certain way, and that classrooms have a certain uniformity to them, that teachers should be able to control necessarily every single aspect of what goes on in a given day. And I feel that a lot of administration doesn't have an appreciation for all of the circumstances that go into any given day in a classroom, whether it's problems occurring at home with individual students, whether it's different styles of learning that respond different ways to curriculum, or simply situations going on between students that a teacher may have no knowledge of going into the lecture. And I think that as a board member, I could work based on the experience that I've had in a positive way to help teachers address those problems and have the flexibility they need to meet the demands of each new crop of students.
Now, let's talk about the education itself. California is, along with other states, implementing the Common Core standards. How do you see the role, or how would you see the implementation of the Common Core standards in the Rocklin School District, and what would you like to see in that area?
Well, Common Core is the law now, so regardless of anyone's personal opinions, it's what we have to deal with.
Right. So it's more a matter of implementation.
It is at this point. But I think going forward with that implementation, there's some room for the board to provide resources to teachers to make it easier. Now, as a district employee, obviously before I was in a district capacity with the workability program, when I was in the classroom, I was part of the Common Core professional development trainings and became very familiar with all of the different stipulations. And while I generally agree with the principle of having cumulative learning and having some set of standards that at the end of the day every student should be able to accomplish, I think it does sort of unduly restrict what curriculum can be valued in a classroom and what methods might be successful. And I think that as a board member, I would like to help provide flexibility for teachers that feel they need it to use additional methods to supplement what's already required in Common Core, and give them the leeway and the understanding to know that, if methods are being applied and they're following, obviously what the state requires, that they will, have the job security and the flexibility to pursue other things that they think will be best for their children. Because ultimately, I think experienced teachers and experienced school staff know best how to reach kids, and not necessarily, educational think tanks or state policy bureaus. So.
Right. Well, now, I think a lot of our viewers are confused about the distinction of Common Core, what it is exactly. Is it just a set of standards? Does it include curriculum? Does it include methods? How much leeway do school districts have in implementing Common Core, and exactly what is Common Core? Is it?
Yeah.
Can you clarify that?
Yeah. Well, there's a core set of standards that begins with root skills in first grade, kindergarten levels, and works to cumulatively build on those standards. And these are described as pretty broad skills. So naturally, as someone with a background in social sciences, teaching government economics, I'll probably elaborate best on those. So for instance, a freshman in high school may be tasked with reading the Declaration of Independence and pulling out some key facts and some key arguments, whereas by the time you get to senior year, you're expected not only to read a document of that caliber and pull out the key arguments, but also to look for logical fallacies, to look for counter arguments that would be valid if you were trying to refute the speaker, and to generate your own argument based on the material and based
So
on
the
the
idea
concepts.
is to stimulate not just memorization, but more thinking, critical
much so.
thinking skills.
Very much a critically centered approach, which, again, for the social sciences is something that I think a lot of people would agree is valuable. However, there are some concerns in other areas. Mathematics, for example, a lot of math teachers aren't really sure how to handle Common Core because it's a radically different way to teach math. You're no longer...
There have been stories in the press lately about it taking 56 minutes to basically solve a problem of 9 plus 6.
Yes.
And what is 9 plus 6? So we hear these kinds of stories and stuff, and I think some of our viewers are interested in what's the context? What do I really understand about Common Core, or what why
Right.
is it really that way?
Well, I think one of the key distinctions that's going to be different going forward is that the way that testing is assessed now, particularly in the math section, it may be so different for English and social science, which already involve a certain amount of critical thinking. But in something like math or science, which used to rely very heavily on memorization, now you will be prompted in the new Smarter Balance testing to answer the problem and provide a justification for why that's the right answer. That will rely more on having a firm understanding of mathematical concepts, having an understanding of various rules and how they interact with each other to solve problems. And it will reduce probably the volume of questions that you're able to offer in a particular math period, because you only, in most classes, have somewhere between 49 minutes to an hour.
So
But
you'd have to
it'll be a
justify
change.
why 9 plus 6 is 15?
Yes.
Not sure how I
Yes.
would do that, but okay.
It's going to be a strange thing
Yes,
for a
it's
lot
a
of
very
students
strange
and a
thing.
lot of teachers, particularly because many of the teachers weren't necessarily trained that way. I'm sure most learned some sort of mathematical reasoning in their math degree, but it's going to be a big adjustment. And I think as a board member, you need to understand that teachers are going to struggle with this in the first few years.
Teachers and parents.
And parents.
Parents that are trying to help their kids with homework are going to be awfully confused about why isn't this something straightforward.
Definitely. And I think the burden is going to be hardest definitely facing high school students and middle school students who have been raised half their educational career on one set of standards and one method of teaching, and now are going to be asked to radically shift into a new testing system and a whole new method of instruction. You're going to find that students who did well at math before may struggle a little bit now. and that may bleed across all subjects. Another aspect of Common Core implementation in some districts has also been a shift away from, sort of staple fiction to more nonfiction informational texts. And
For example,
well, the focus would be on providing, the competency that students would be able to go and pull files off the DMV and understand regulations and things like that, and understand the instructions to complete a driver's license application or to complete a W-4 or an I-9. And
in other words, real-life type of situations.
real-life type of situations, which is valuable. But we are going to lose, because of the way that it's constructed, I think, some of that exposure to classic literature that most people were familiar with reading. You may not read To Kill a Mockingbird in 9th grade. You may focus more on building literacy of legal documents and things like that. You will probably read a fair amount of fiction, depending on your teacher, but it's the constraint that you get from that is adding an additional component and then having to pick and choose which materials are really most pertinent.
Now, as we said, Common Core is the law, so that's not something that's in debate here. It's
No.
more the implementation of it. How much leeway is there in the curriculum as long as it meets the goals or the requirements of Common Core? How much leeway does a school really have?
Well, it'll vary across districts to some extent. Some districts are implementing it differently. There's suggested reading lists, for example, in my district, and it also varies, I would imagine, across school sites. I worked in alternative ed, and we had a certain amount of leeway that general education sites don't offer. And so I think teachers are going to feel very constrained at first.
Well, now, as a candidate for the school board in Rocklin, you would be part of setting how this Common Core standards are implemented.
Yes.
How would you implement them? How much leeway would you provide, and how much flexibility would you like to see in the Rocklin school system?
Well, I think that, as I've said before, teachers should be free to use the materials they think will reach their students. Now, I've been fortunate to have that sort of leeway working with students at Pacific High School, but most schools don't offer that. I think there's ways to teach to Common Core standards that don't necessarily rely on a state reading list or on lists that may be approved by district policy now, that have a capacity to reach students who may not be inspired by Shakespeare. And while I certainly would not want to insult the bard, there may be other ways to reach students and teach those same skills. And what I would like to do as a board member is, provide the capacity to meet those standards, but also have the flexibility to match the interests of your students to what you're teaching to meet those standards, because ultimately it's about making sure that they have the skills to succeed after they leave high school. And most of the current curriculum or suggested reading lists, could be learned anywhere.
Right. Let's shift focus a little bit from Common Core and the standards. Let's talk a little bit about the schools themselves, and particularly teachers in the schools. Right now, public school teachers have the right to belong to a union, and they are unionized. How do you feel about that? Should school teachers, public school teachers, be part of a bargaining system or a bargaining unit, such as the Teachers Association?
I do. I am a member of California School Employees as a transition specialist for workability. I've served as a site representative for my union when I was at Pacific High School, and currently serve on the Budget Advisory Committee as a union representative for Twin Rivers budgets. And I think that particularly in education, where you have a lot of intense emotions, because we're dealing with kids, we're dealing with our children's future, some of the things that are provided by union negotiations, such as job security, such as arbitration in the case of complaints, disputes, are invaluable to make sure that teachers are allowed to do their job. For instance, the debate over evolution and intelligent design. A science teacher could get in a lot of trouble depending on what material they teach. And it may be that the best way for them to reach their kids is to provide material in a certain way. And some parents may be upset about that. Now, if you were at an at-will employer, which most non-union sites are, one complaint from a parent could have a great teacher removed from their job. And if you really care about a quality education, sometimes you may have to push boundaries. And you may have to challenge kids to find their own opinions and to really critically think about things, not necessarily to change their mind or the values that were instilled in them by their parents, but to really understand their perspective and understand why they believe what they believe.
Good point. On the other hand, there is a counter-argument that's been presented in the courts recently that union representation, to the detriment of a student's education, tend to keep maybe lower quality teachers who have been in the system for a long time at the expense of doing away with teachers that might be newer and more capable. That's the Garrett decision that was in the California Supreme Court.
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I think any member of any school site would be lying to you if they didn't feel that sometimes bad teachers do exist and they're protected by seniority. But when you think about what our teachers are sacrificing, about the work that goes into being a teacher, much more than is in the 6 or 7 hours spent at the school site. If you think about all of the time and effort that good teachers put into developing quality lessons, I think they deserve a reward for that service. And teachers who have worked in the district and cultivated the minds in our community for 20, 30 years deserve some protection. Now, younger teachers sometimes may have more energy, and they may come in and be better trained on educational technology because it's more recent for them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of their output is better than a teacher who has that experience in the classroom and has been there for decades working with students and understanding maybe better some of the behavioral issues and the nuances of dealing with kids with different learning styles that a newer teacher may not have.
It's certainly a controversial subject, and it's making its way through the appeals process within the state of California. We'll have to wait and see how it eventually plays itself out. You mentioned something that I passed over for a moment, but I'd like to come back to. You gave it as an example, and that is the teaching of creative design versus evolution in science classes. Do you think there's a place for teaching things like creative design in a science class?
I think that ultimately a science teacher knows best how to engage the topic with their students, and that we shouldn't be introducing any sort of blanket policy one way or the other. Because while personally I may have issues with the teaching of creative design, I think that if there's a way that a science teacher can engage their students on the topic, because in most schools the question will be asked if there's any sort of religious community in that district. The question will be asked, and the teacher will ultimately have to deal with it. They should be able to decide in their classroom and for their particular group how to address that question.
One of the main things that schools do, and one of the main roles of a school, is to prepare students for what comes next.
Yes.
Whether what comes next is a 4-year education in a university, whether it's a vocational instruction, or whether it's just going out into the workforce. How do you see the role of preparing our students to take the next step? We've been focused a lot on preparing students for 4-year colleges and 4-year degrees, but there's an increasing need for vocational education as well.
Definitely.
What would you do to bolster vocational education in our schools?
Well, I think the state of vocational education in most districts is pretty sad right now. We've been operating under an educational model since I was in high school, and a decade or so before that assumes everyone should go to a 4-year college. And not to diminish the importance of education, but that model doesn't necessarily fit our economy anymore. We have record numbers of student loan debt and of people in my generation who, despite having achieved 4-year degrees or master's degrees and better, can't find employment in their field
Mhm.
because there's an oversaturation of college-educated individuals. And given that, I think at this stage we can clearly sort of recognize that college necessarily isn't a guarantee to success anymore, we may look at providing some alternative options. Now, I'm reminded of a model that is used abroad in some capacities, particularly of something that's used in German universities, where schools partner as part of their curriculum with local businesses, manufacturing sector businesses, to provide academic instruction.
Mhm.
So a German student studying engineering may go study at BMW and do a year or so of his degree working in the field. And I think if we could incorporate something along those lines
Mhm.
in Rocklin and throughout our state, we would have a much better chance to offer not only pathways to tangible jobs, but maybe get students interested in some of the jobs that are in high demand now that aren't being filled. We have a number of trade sectors that don't have enough workers,
Yes.
despite record unemployment, particularly among youth. Well, I shouldn't say record, but very high unemployment among youth who've come out of college but don't necessarily have the right training for that. And I think looking at those industries, we can begin to build partnerships and build a pathway for students who may not necessarily want to pursue a degree in art or philosophy or English or mathematics, to look at that as a viable option, and
Yep.
and to not do what I think happens to a certain extent in our high schools now, of belittling the option of developing a trade and using that as a path to secure your livelihood before securing your dreams.
Yeah, and the education that we do provide in vocational education, we still have classes in high school and many high schools in industrial arts or shop and so on. But what we've seen is that a lot of these courses are grossly outdated.
Yes.
There's no education of modern manufacturing methods. If you're going to have a class on automotive repair, for example, our automotive industry is totally different than it was 30 years ago. It's much more computer-based. You can't find carburetors in cars anymore. Very few schools, and there are notable exceptions, will teach things about hybrid engines, for example, and all-electric cars, more the wave of the future. Is there
Definitely.
something that we can do to modernize our education in industrial arts to keep up with where the industry has really gone?
Well, I think so, and even those classrooms are disappearing, I would like to add. In Twin Rivers, we have 4 comprehensive high schools, and 2 of them don't even have those auto shops anymore.
Yeah.
But I think certainly looking at which businesses are demanding new employees, we can get a good idea of where the industry is going, what skills are needed to move forward, and partner with those employers to figure out how we can develop curriculum. Auto shop is an easy step. An auto shop education can certainly get you a job working at Les Schwab now, doing brakes and tires. But with all the investment we've been doing in technology in the schools, it makes sense to look at, okay, what's the next level beyond that?
Right.
And to build some of the more complicated procedures into the system so that we can actually, when somebody leaves high school, maybe have them certified to go work in a particular job sector. There's no reason why, a senior or a junior that's not particularly interested in going to Davis or Sacramento State or wherever they might go can't begin instead working on getting a trade certification and using, ROP options and CTE options that are already available to get that taken care of before they even leave.
Yeah, there are some very notable exceptions that have school systems that have done a fantastic job in education in certain vocations. South Lake Tahoe is one example that I've heard of that has done a fantastic job. So perhaps we can learn from some of those other systems as well.
Definitely.
Let's talk a little bit about one other topic, and that is vouchers. Vouchers for private schools and also charter schools. What do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of that kind of a system?
Well, in an extreme circumstance, A voucher does provide a student whose district may be low performing a chance to get a better education. And that certainly seems attractive to individual parents. It may provide a better outcome to that teacher, but the number of vouchers you can provide are going to be limited. And I think one of the big disconnects in public perception of charters versus public perception of our public school system is that they don't necessarily understand that most charters are able to very much handpick who they take.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well, first of all, do charter schools provide a better education?
I would argue that they do not.
They
Now,
do not.
I think that charter schools perform very well because they're selective and they don't have to be inclusive. As a charter, if a student becomes a disciplinary issue,
Mm-hmm.
you can remove him and send him back to the public school system.
Mm-hmm.
You can also pick, particularly in the case of performing arts charters, technology charters, students who have a measured aptitude for your curriculum and for your particular method of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates an artificially high performance. Now, I suppose I should say that they do provide a quality education to those students. But if we're looking at this promise of universal education, we have to think first about how do we make it so that not only those high-performing students, those students who are able to afford private schools, or those students who are able to get into a charter and get the support from their parents and from the community that they need to stay there, can succeed, but also students who come from less advantaged backgrounds have a chance to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
If we're as a country going to at all cling to this equality of opportunity, we have to invest in a public school system that provides for all of our students.
Right.
And even those that, for lack of a better term, don't perform well.
Do you have any closing words that you'd like to let us know about?
I would like to say simply that I think the experience that I have in the classroom is distinct from what most board members in our district and in other districts have. I've worked with students in very challenging settings, students in alternative ed who don't have an ideal home life, who have experienced problems with drug addiction, with criminal history, and violence in their community. I've worked with students with a range of special education issues, and found how to make education work for those individuals, and how to find a path for success that may not have been evident at first. I feel that having that experience will be invaluable to this board, and that the sheer diversity of opinion that I would bring to the board will be invaluable, as it would be to any democratic institution, to have a range of opinions and perspectives. I think because of my age, which is, I imagine, significantly younger than most candidates in this election, I have a real understanding of what college is like now, what the job market is like now, and how difficult it is, and what steps you need to take to be successful in an economy that's radically different than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And I think that will serve the kids in this district well.
Very good. Well, we wish you
Thank
all
you.
the luck in your campaign, and thank you so much for being with us on our show today. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us on Blue Values TV, and until next time, good night.